you've already met me. I'm Dr. Emily David. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm one part of the clinical lead for the crisis team within Hampshire CAMS. And I've got the unenviable task of talking about understanding crisis in about half an hour, which is a bit of a tall order. So I'm standing here today as a professional, but I'm also a human. And I've been personally and professionally bereaved by suicide. So I really hope to do this some justice, and I can't cover it all in half an hour, but I really hope that both parts of my presentation today will be food for thought, and I'm going to invite you to really think about yourselves as I talk, because yes, we're here to think about young people and young people's crisis, but we are adult caregivers, and we interact and we work with and we support and we connect with young people every day in our work. And so I really want you to kind of reflect on yourself as I go through. And I will be sharing some personal anecdotes as we go along also. So the first part, what we'll do before coffee break, is understanding crisis, defining it. I'm going to be talking about tipping points and avalanches. I'm going to be talking about some slippery slopes, which are risk factors and warning signs. I'm going to be talking about chain reactions and parallel processing. So that is the kind of interaction and the interplay between a young person and an adult caregiver. And then after coffee, we'll have a little look at adult responses. So, here we go, first part. What is crisis? Well, crisis is subjective. It's unique to each and every single person in respect to what it looks like, what it feels like, what the triggers are, the contributing factors, and also in terms of how we cope and how we manage. It's all subjective. And this is really, really important because ultimately, I think it's quite easy to become habituated, like we hear it day in, day out, there's so much crisis, everybody's struggling with their mental health. And because we can then become overwhelmed by just the kind of sheer volume of young people that experience this, we perhaps don't then connect with an individual who is presenting in crisis and listening to their story. And it's crisis to them. So it doesn't matter what your view on it is, or how you might feel, how you might cope, or how you might deal with that situation. It matters to that individual and what they're going through. So, crisis is often a result of struggling with or battling and feeling unable to cope. And that can lead people to feeling really reactive, impulsive, and risky. But crisis doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is experiencing a mental health difficulty. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is going to engage in self-harm or suicide. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it will go on forever. Or it also doesn't mean that it is just discrete. We know that people can have an episode of crisis, bounce back, have another episode of crisis, bounce back, have another episode of crisis. That doesn't void that person's experience. It's unique to each and every person. So I want to introduce you to something called the window of tolerance. Is it popped up? Yes, there we go. This is just a neat way of kind of thinking about how much stuff can we deal with. So on the graph behind me, the green band is the zone of kind of optimal coping, how much stuff we can cope with. Now for each and every person, every young person that you work with, that you support with, will have a window of tolerance. You will have a window of tolerance. Now, some of us, our windows of tolerance will be quite narrow, and perhaps we won't be able to cope with or deal with as much stuff as perhaps the person we're sitting next to. Other people, their window of tolerance might be quite wide. But here's the rub, it changes. It's not static. And it can change on a daily basis, depending on what's going on around us. Internal factors, external factors. And we can come outside of our window of tolerance. And that's often when we struggle to cope and we struggle to manage, and that's when we might experience a crisis. So within a day, our emotions and our ability to cope will go up and down, up and down, up and down, as depicted by the white line here. And for some people, it'll go up and down a lot. And for some people, less so. It'll be kind of more of a meandering up and down. So we're all different. And that can make it really hard trying to support a young person, particularly if you don't know them particularly well, because we're not completely sure what their window of tolerance is, how up and down they are, what pushes them out of their window of tolerance, how do we get them back in their window of tolerance? And then bring yourselves into it, your own window of tolerance. Are you within your window of tolerance today? How is it? Is it narrow? Is it wide? Because that will be a really important factor. And I'll come back to that in a sec. So we've all got this kind of fluctuating ability to cope with stuff on a day-to-day basis. It's a crisis. Why does it happen? When does it happen? Well, if we think about an avalanche, what we know about an avalanche is that there have to be certain conditions, certain factors, certain situations, and a tipping point is reached. And when we get to that tipping point, that's when an avalanche is more likely to happen. And so we're thinking about risk factors. And risk factors are characteristics that make it more likely that individuals will consider, attempt, or die by suicide, or experience crisis. And risk factors can be found at various levels, individual levels, so things like genetic predispositions, mental health disorders, personality traits, family levels, levels of cohesion, levels of dysfunction, and community, so the accessibility and availability of mental health services being a key one. And risk factors can be fixed, so things that can't be changed, so perhaps a family history of suicide, or modifiable, so things that can be changed, such as experiencing an episode of depression. So although risk factors generally contribute towards a kind of long-term risk, the immediate stressors can be the tipping points. And that can be sort of, everyday stresses, breakups, financial difficulties, rejection, perceived or real failure. And that's when we're more likely to experience a crisis. Oh, I'm a bit behind on the animations, sorry, there's the avalanche. So I just want to have a little think about risk factors and warning signs, and we really need to know the difference, because risk factors are not warning signs. They're often confused with warning signs, but the two are very different. So warning signs indicate an immediate risk of suicide, whereas risk factors indicate that somebody's at heightened risk for suicide. But the risk factors kind of indicate little to nothing about that immediate risk. So warning signs are only applicable to individuals, whereas kind of risk and protective factors are found in individuals and communities. And being able to tell the difference is really, really important in communications about managing and assessing risk. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now exploring risk factors, and then we're going to be looking at warning signs. And this is really important because whilst there is no one person who is responsible, and we certainly don't want to get into any kind of blame game, we do have individual collective responsibility to think about things like risk factors, protective factors. We've all kind of opted to come here today. You've got invested interest. You care about this topic. You want to make a difference. So if we can be aware of some of the risk factors, there might be things that we can do to perhaps lower those risks. So when considering risk and protective factors, we need to keep some things in mind. So not all risk and protective factors are created equal. And not all risk and protective factors that we're going to identify will have the same impact for individuals. Now, as I go through some of these things, you're probably going to be sitting there thinking about the young people that you work with and support, thinking, oh my God, every single kid that I work with has got a million risk factors. And yeah, we all do. Absolutely all of us has a breaking point, a tipping point. Absolutely all of us can get to the point of having a personal avalanche. And I guess what we're wanting to do is try and identify what they are so we can, where possible, mitigate them by looking at protective factors, by looking at some of the things that Natalie was talking about earlier. So, here we go. Personal, emotional health and well-being. I should say these lists aren't exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but I've kind of tried to kind of highlight some of the key ones that we kind of frequently see. And really helpful some of the discussions that we've already had. As you can see on here, we've got autistic spectrum conditioners up there. I'm not going to read these out because they're listed and they're in your packs. But I think you'll just see as I go through just how many things that we personally experience as well as our young people. Oh, missed one out. Physical health. One of the things I just wanted to, well, two things I want to draw your attention to here is acne. Right. How many people had spots growing up? I know I did. And it was hell. And I think it's really easy as adults to perhaps not really validate some of the issues that our young people experience. Bullying is another one. We hear it so often. But my God, that lived experience of being bullied for an individual is horrific. So just because we hear about it a lot, we shouldn't ever become desensitized to the real inner turmoil and distress that some of these issues can bring about. And acne is one of them. It's a known risk factor for suicide. And the other one is the last one, the premenstrual exacerbation or premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Now, Emily, give us the wave at the back. Emily's got a stand, and she's come from up north, God bless her, to have a stand here. Because hormones is such a huge part of being a teenager, and they're rife, they're not settled, they're all over the place. And they're really significant, and they have really significant impact on our mental health and our well-being, our ability to cope. I don't know anywhere near enough about this. I'm not the person to ask, but Emily at the back absolutely is. To seek her out on a lunch or break time. I'm ever so grateful that she's come down today to give a shout out for hormones. We'll move on. Relational, social. Look, we don't live on our own. We've talked about this before. We're part of a tribe, we're part of a pack, we're part of communities. And it's great, isn't it? We've got friends and it's all going well, but my God, teenagers, it doesn't go so well, does it? I was talking to somebody the other day who just started year 7, so it's brilliant. I've made a really good friendship group, and the very next week, and sworn enemies. And that's the way it goes. And you'd like to think it settles down, but you know, these are real issues for kids. And yes, it happens all the time, and I'm sure all the teachers in the room be like, oh, my door is constantly being knocked because there's been a fallout here and a fallout there. And it would be so easy to just be like, oh, I know, but come on, get to maths. But, you know, for some kids, this stuff is make or break. It's really tough. I'm going to keep going, there's loads. Environmental, community, this is a biggie. Work for CAMS, we've got CAMS colleagues here. Certainly, I know our waiting lists are pretty big at the moment, and I'm sure many of you know it's quite tricky with trying to access CAMS services. We are here. We are trying to be as accessible as possible, but the volume and the demand is far outweighing our current resource, and that's a really difficult position. It's difficult as individual clinicians, it's difficult for managers, it's difficult for the service as a whole, and also with the charities and the third sector organisations that are here and represented today. I know that you're also feeling kind of overwhelmed and swamped by the kind of need and needing to do more outreach work too, and just how difficult that is when you're kind of under-resourced. But the bottom line is we know that a risk factor for suicide is inaccessibility and the poor availability of services, not just mental health services, but specific services. So we know that being part of the LGBTQ plus community is a risk factor. So we need those services and we need them to be available and we need them to be accessible. I've just picked on that one because I clocked you, Dawn, sorry. Dawn's here from Y Services. She's a good person to connect to too. And Natalie's already spoken at length about social media, so I won't kind of go into more detail about that, but it's the world we're living in, so it's a really tricky balance, isn't it? We can often be aware of all of these things. I'm sure for most of you, there's not been many surprises on the slides so far, and it's just kind of then knowing what to do with it, and that's hard, isn't it? Because there isn't always an answer. And here we've got kind of contextual factors. And my final one, I think, is the absence of protective factors. So there are lots of protective factors, and I'm going to come on to those in a little bit. But ultimately, we can stack up our risk factors, we can have loads, but you might be coping because you've also got loads of protective factors, the things that are going to keep you safe and mitigate against the kind of risk factors that you're experiencing. And we know that if you don't have protective factors, you're much more at risk of experiencing this crisis. Skip a slide. Let's go to warning signs. So, these are the things that you're going to see that indicate that somebody is at immediate risk of ending their life, or that they're in crisis. And what we often see is there's a collection of thoughts, physical feelings, and emotions, that myriad, that triad coming together with a behavioural response. There's a nice little acronym here, is PATH-WARM. Again, this isn't exhaustive, but this is quite a good, succinct summary of the key warning signs that you're likely to see when someone is in crisis or experiencing kind of strong thoughts and urges around ending their life. So we've got ideation, that is thoughts of suicide. Substance misuse, so increase or excessive alcohol, drug use. That purposelessness, that's quite hard to say, purposelessness. So seeing no reason for living. Anxiety, feeling trapped, there's no way out, there's no other option, I can't problem solve this. Hopelessness, feeling hopeless about yourself, others, the future, that the situation will never change. Withdrawal, anger, recklessness and mood changes. Now, for many of you sitting in the audience, I'm sure you think, God, again, I can think of loads of children where this applies. But I guess what you're looking for is changes, or significant changes. Something that's like not quite the norm for them. Or they might be actually quite subtle. And that's why it's quite hard to pick up. And these changes can happen really, really quickly. I know myself in clinic. I can see somebody for an hour session, we can leave that session, and I can feel fairly confident that they're feeling okay, we've got a great plan, they're leaving my clinic relatively happy, and I can get a call a few hours later to say there's been a crisis, and that young person has perhaps acted on some of their urges and impulses, and I'm sitting there thinking, what happened? It's only been like 3 hours. But this can move quick. Crisis can happen quick, and as Natalie has really beautifully highlighted, we know that teenagers are reactive, they're impulsive. So let's just take it back to our window of tolerance. What does it actually look like when you're out of your window of tolerance? Well, you can kind of go one of two ways. Of course, it can go lots of ways, but for the purpose of this, it can go one of two ways. So we've got hyper-arousal. This is your real classic fight or flight. It's typically characterised by really intense emotion, high levels of panic and anxiety, and powerful feelings that can be really, really unpleasant and scary to experience. It can be really characterised by impulsiveness, dysregulated behaviour, and reactive behaviour. And behaviour might sort of include distress, verbal or physical hostility or aggression towards others or oneself, running away, engaging in behaviour that might be considered risky or unsafe. It's that real classic fight or flight. Yeah. It's quite demonstrative. You're going to notice it, you're going to see it, you're going to hear it when somebody's in hyper-arousal state. Conversely, we've got hypoarousal. So this typically occurs when the situation or the emotions being experienced are so overwhelming and so intolerable that an individual sort of experiences involuntary shutdown. And it's often characterised by withdrawal, disconnection, dissociation, feelings of numbness or emptiness. And for some people, they may not be able to respond, communicate, or engage in any kind of task or activity. Although there are lots of others that can go into sort of autopilot mode. So on the surface, it might look like they're functioning and coping, but inside, emotionally, psychologically, they're completely checked out. So you might have heard the term freeze as the kind of third part tryout to the fight, flight, freeze. So freeze describes hypoarousal really well. As a general rule of thumb, if a person is going to become dysregulated, experience distress or crisis, they're roughly going to fall into one of the two camps, although all people can experience both states. But here is where it gets really juicy. So not only have you got a tough job as a professional, working with, supporting with a young person, trying to work out their window of tolerance. Are they in it? Are they out of it? What's pushed them out of it? Where are they at with it? So it's really important you're thinking about yourself, okay, in these situations. Because if you're having a bad day, and you're at the edge of your window of tolerance, perhaps you're running late, you're tired, you've had an argument with your partner, perhaps you've got an assessment coming up at work, you're juggling multiple demands, and then you walk into work, got loads to do, and you're faced with crisis, or you're faced with some challenging behaviour, or a young person tells you to fuck off as you walk through the door, chances are, I know Karen's laughing, that's happened, doesn't it, Karen? Yeah. Chances are, it might tip you outside of your window of tolerance, and then perhaps you're not going to be in perhaps the best space to help regulate either yourself or that other young person. So, here we go. I want to just illustrate something to you. Oh my goodness, I went a bit fancy on the animation on this one. Here we go. Parallel processing. Let's take the young person here. They're going to have some thoughts, some feelings, and some behaviour. And there's going to be a connection, there's going to be an interaction with the adult caregiver. If you're that person that's sitting with them in crisis, we're going to talk about tipping points. We've talked about tipping points that can tip you into crisis, but we can tip the other way too. Let's take this example. Young person is having some thoughts. I can't cope. Everybody hates me. They're feeling upset. They're feeling overwhelmed. They've got that fight response. It's demonstrative, it's evocative, it's antagonistic. They're ready to fight. As an adult, you're walking in and you're thinking, oh my God, what's going on? What's happening? You might be feeling quite panicked. Oh my God, what am I going to do about this? You might be also quite frustrated, like, this timing is terrible. And so you shout at them, sit down, be quiet. Can't this just wait? Not right now. Come on, you know better than this. Don't talk to me like that. And then it goes into another cycle. That young person's got that reinforced thought. Everyone hates me. I can't cope with this. And you go round and round in cycles. And before you know it, both of you have escalated and you're outside of your window of tolerance. And it's really easy to see how crisis can ramp up without too much effort. The last slide I want to share with you just before we go to a break is the cycle of crisis. There's loads of cycles of crisis, but what's really interesting is that people often think that what you're seeing in the moment of crisis, that's the worst bit, that's as bad as it's going to get. Actually, what's really important is to think about the recovery phase. Because if you're somebody like me and you're slow to cool, and it takes you a while to come out of your window of tolerance, chances are you can be reignited quite quickly. And if you're quite demonstrative in your distress, as I was, in that Michael Bublé episode, you're going to have a lot of guilt and a lot of shame, which can further exacerbate a different kind of crisis. So the cool-down period in the post-crisis low is as risky as the initial crisis phase. So it's really important we're thinking about what we're doing to support somebody whilst in the acute episode of crisis and then the post-crisis phase. And that's what I'm going to be looking at and thinking about with you after the break time, our kind of adult responses.